Hi, I'm Barbara Bunker. I'm a group of one. I was trained in the early 60s. I went back to graduate school in my 30s, and I went to Columbia Teachers College, where Morton Deutsch and Matt Miles were working. And Matt Miles, who's a name that you don't probably know, did the first systems intervention in schools. And I was one of many research assistants. We watched interventions and we documented, basically. And I watched the staff plan, Ron Libet, Paul Buchanan, Goodwin Watson, all of the early founders from NTL were working in a suburb of Pittsburgh called Westinghouse Valley, and in Mount Vernon, a suburb of New York City. And we did survey feedback, that is to say, we collected data from the whole system, and then we helped the system figure out what they wanted to do to fix the problems in the system. This was before future orientation. So we were problem oriented. We wanted to improve the system, sort of small group improvement. And in that same time period, in the middle 60s, the first group of people came together who actually called themselves OD folks. And they were, I'm not naming them all, but Billy Albin, Warner Burke, and a group of people in the New York City area formed a network which became the OD network. They met for the first time in 1965. And that group met monthly and eventually developed into the OD network. And it was a very interesting time to be around because the whole field was dominated by men who were white. And NTL was all male and all white, except for Edie Seashore, who was an anomaly. And the only way you could become a consultant, I thought, was all the consultants were PhDs operating out of university bases. So the union card to become a consultant was basically to go to the, get a PhD and go to the university, basically. And you went to the way you got entrance into NTL, the club, was to go to the 9-week internship program at Bethel, Maine. Now you had to get admitted to this 9-week program. I went there in 1968, and I worked very hard to do that. The first week I was there, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. And I mean, it was a very uproarious time that all of this stuff was happening. And so what happened was that my dissertation stuff, which I was working on, got delayed because of the disruption in the social fabric, and Columbia went up in smoke that same year. Basically, we had riots on the campus, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a very complicated time. In 1970, Harvey Harnstein, Marion Guinness, Barbara Bunker, and Warner Burke put together one of the earliest books on social intervention. It has stuff about OD in it. And at the same time, the University of Michigan was doing a lot of stuff around data feedback, and there were a lot of tensions with the West Coast, because the West Coast was not focused on systems, it was focused on individuals and therapy and personal development, et cetera, et cetera. End of story.
So we're going to all these, and many of us were going to these NTL trainings at this point. We were graduate students, we were young internal folks, we were, our big interventions were flip chart. We also could do one thing maybe, which was team building. Sometimes we could do survey development, but that was sort of, touch and go. But we were full of energy and self-discovery and learning things like body-mind connection, and kind of had this sort of sense of just go out and do good work. But there was a lot of social research and theory going on, but also a lot of experimentation, because there weren't a lot of books. And there weren't a lot of quote OD programs. So there was a sense that you could kind of make it up. And then we had the Johnson administration and lots of funding a lot of this research. So it was pretty dynamic time. We had things like Earth Day and feminism and business schools trying to introduce things like organizational behavior and things like that. So where we are, we started to talk about the implications and that we're still inventing. We kind of grew up with that sense of openness and experimentation. We want to still connect many of us to community work. We still want to kind of come back to that roots of community. We feel like there's a real separation now between academics and practitioner and fragmentation of theories. Going back to many of us coming out of this group dynamics and steeped in that theory, we're a little remorseful that it's not being taught in the OD programs today. And that led to a discussion about, well, maybe we've got all these geographically dispersed teams, so maybe it's global group dynamics or something like that. But we wanted to let you know that the flower children are not dead. And that this sense of being grounded in theory but there was a lot of experimentation, so there was a sense that the community needed each other, so that there were a lot of like-minded people who didn't know what they were doing, but there was some kind of comfort in that.
The sense that there's a momentum building now by the 80s, and so what we discovered in our group was that those of us in the group began to come to OD in a variety of ways, actually, through activism, through the nonprofit sector, through business and so forth. We began to evolve into it. And the world was changing. In the 80s, there was a nexus of many sectors that brought on this change. One of the things that we saw was that government services began to be cut, and then that, by necessity, forced the nonprofits to come to rising. We even heard that it was at that time in the 80s that Peter Drucker formed his foundation for nonprofits and expressed to the world that he declared to the world that the nonprofits were the best run companies in America or organizations in America. So there you go. And so we believe that it was at this point that the work became now not just emerging but very significant and necessary to the world. There was citizen leadership that began to emerge across sectors, and we saw the rise of technology, specifically communication technology, so that the way that we were connecting with each other, which is very much what this work's about, and communicating, began to change. So we saw in general some paradigm shifts, a turning point we sensed in the 80s. The third wave was written Alvin Toffler, so some visionaries. And what was coming out of the innovation in the 80s was a movement now to look at, to study, to work more with what brings organizations alive. We had future search, the early inquiry there, appreciative inquiry. We had, thank you, we had quality circles, and all of those things that were going on in the 80s we felt related to employee engagement, a growing valuing of diversity, and an awareness with Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, and Bhopal, an awareness of environmental influences on us. Okay. And an interrelatedness that was connected. So what I'd like to leave you with as we merge into the 90s is the feeling then toward the end with the Berlin Wall coming down of now a sense of possibilities that began to come into our field, we think, because now we saw in the world possibilities for things to happen that we never thought could happen.
Well, what a good note to move on from, because that's where we found ourselves. And we managed 5 words and a squiggle, which is an egg. And we felt that those possibilities were an egg cracking open. We weren't sure if it was a dinosaur inside or some kind of beautiful bird, but the egg was cracking open. And all of us came into the field, not through a sort of understood route. We came in through working with art, with psychopathic criminals, we came in through family therapy, we came in through carpentry, we came in through experiential work, but we were all experimenting and trying some things that were really very different and sort of found a home in the general field, I suppose, of OD. We felt in terms of connection, therefore, that the world was changing quite rapidly in a period that had been quite structured in the 80s. Suddenly there was a whole host of possibilities. Certainly as a European it felt that way, with the wall coming down and the Thatcher period ending and all sorts of stuff going on. So on the sort of global scale things were changing, and we looked back and thought that for all of us it was a point where we were doing some quite different things with our lives. Some people staying in work for some length of time for the first time, others going in some quite deep personal reflection. So we were all at a point of change as the world was changing too, and we thought the implications for us here were we must keep experimenting, but we thought a cautionary note there was that our experimenting caused some harm as well as some great benefit, and we should learn from what we did last time and make sure that we catch that this time round, and that maybe if we feel the world is freeing again, these things perhaps come in cycles. We're at a good time to be in this sort of exploration now. So that's, I think, where we got to.
We had a wave theory because we found this as a time of a clash of worldviews really coming to the fore. And re-engineering and expert consulting were very much on the rise, very much in vogue, and yet at the same time there was this other wave that was forming that was dialogic and whole system, and books were published that were seminal. The Fifth Discipline came out, and Leadership in the New Science, and the early future search kind of work were taking these ideas and bringing them into broader awareness. So things began to crystallize, and this stuff began to take root. So it moved from the early pioneering kind of stage into kind of early adopters and people beginning to make things happen. So this was really a time of a clash and confusion and mixed messages and good things going on in some places and things falling apart in some places. And I'd say that this whole idea of systems thinking and systems theory started to make its way into our language and our vernacular. As a matter of fact, the term stakeholder, which came out of the future search world, entered the vernacular, and the idea of shareholders, when people first started talking about stakeholders, that confusion was there, and it's not there anymore. So that was kind of the sense of the era, and when we get into the implications, we're almost a generation into this now. And so this wild, divergent ride, I think there were two implications that we were seeing. Is a generation in, it feels like we should be at a point of finding the coherence, once again, of this, this vast breaking apart that we were experiencing in the early 90s, and that the initial conditions, we've been doing the experimenting with people-based work and with, whole group work, that we're just steeped, we're primed and ready for something to land and launch us into the next round of possibilities.
And then there was another wave in this group of OD practitioners. So there was a lot of stuff happening in OD, which is not my experience, so I'm going to try to represent it, but I don't know if it'll be accurate. So like OD was just taking on new forms apparently in this time, while the whole change, which is the world that I identified with, was happening. And there was all this new language, I was, for myself, I was inside of an organization, and my CEOs came back with a set of tapes from a Pegasus conference, and the first thing I heard was Dee Hock talking about chaotic alliance, and I thought, what the hell is this stuff? So it was like new languaging, really exciting time, lots of new ideas, people trying all kinds of things, money for it, it seemed. My organization was investing in this stuff. A lot of learning, lots of talk about learning. We hired a chief learning officer where I worked, and that was a really big thing. Apparently in the OD world, there was lots of new training initiatives, new things like that. Also OD popping or moving into government. It was starting to take hold there. changes in connection to government and schools. A lot of kind of murky lines between OD, HR training, that sort of stuff. OD goes online, kind of the early stuff around that. And a lot of talk about and work around new ways of working together was kind of the language that was big where I sat. So.
We started with this metaphor of a permaculture in the culture as a whole and in our work. I didn't even know what that meant, but apparently it's kind of where, if I get this right, where different ecologies come together and out of on the boundaries of their differences, a kind of new synergy develops. So that's, that was the metaphor that kind of guided us. And then we went, we quickly identified that this was the era where these high engagement, participatory, whole system processes, which had, a number of them had been invented previously, but they really started to coalesce. It was the beginnings of the coalescence. Barbara's and Billy's book was the first time that all of these things were really brought together in an integrative way. And then we started talking about society as a whole and the technology changes escalating, and the internet in particular really starting to take off in the late 90s. And how this, this came later in our process, but the whole idea of the internet being both simultaneously a place of convergence and divergence simultaneously, where it kind of allows for large groups to form, and also new kinds of small groups, virtual small groups. So that was very profound. So we talked more about social issues. It was kind of the period of the dot-com boom and a bubble of things were just going to be fine. The end of history, etc. Then we started really connecting, though, with what brought us into the work, and we quickly saw that we came from so many different directions. We really joined the field and connected with this work at a very diverse background, very, very diverse.
30 seconds.
And yet there was something about it that brought us all together. And we ended up with this metaphor of the eye of the needle. That there's something about the way this work was converging that was providing some kind of a forum, somewhat similar to the internet in a way, bringing us all together, allowing for great divergence and yet at the same time at least some possibility for convergence.
We're 2000s. We started out actually looking at the board, and we realized that there was a lot of second editions and 2.0s in 2000s, which we thought was really interesting, that this seems to be a time of refinement and evolution.
Oh, okay. We also noticed somebody had written up their positive organizational theory, and what we were thinking that meant was this
You've gotta accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and on to the affirmative, and don't mess with Mr. In Between.
But this was sort of about paying attention to what's working and building on that.
We also noticed that things had started to go global, so some of these things were starting to proliferate around the globe as well. I'll just do the next one. There's a real democratization of the field. It's really getting out there, communicating, organizing, the whole idea of empowerment, self-organizing. You can do this too.
And then we talked about sort of the proliferation of information and methods, and what came to mind was Myron the other day had said using every tool for every problem, and we really resonated with that there's this idea of being very holistic and self-aware and having knowledge about a lot of things, but knowing when to use it with whom is sort of part of developing practice amongst us.
And then finally, we talked a little bit about who are we. Yeah, our group was a little, woo, okay. We started talking a little bit about who are we in terms of quality. Now that all these methods are out there and people are really engaging with it, you know, they're going through Open Space, they're going through World Cafe, et cetera, but we seem to have this real a divergence in quality, and that part of the challenge or part of the implication for the future now is what is quality? Is this something that, you know, everybody can do, or are there some standards to it? And we think that there's some real implications for that work.
And paid attention to the extremes going from both positive to negative. Events that were specific in our field and those that maybe were a little more tangential. Emphasis on community and collective. We also noted the several publications and second editions. We noted an interest in healthcare, health disparities, and education. The internet and the web were big. Social and community focus, grassroots, collective gathering, international and global. Most of the publications in this period were multi-author, and people getting together to get their voices heard was important. Then we tried to connect that to what was going on in the world, and we paid attention to there were failed political figures, political transitions, and social transitions. The internet was seen as a way to connect people and maybe get voices heard, blogging. Attention again to global and international, and we tied systems conference and this conference together. There were also a lot of wars and violence, global visibility of local issues because of technology supporting information sharing, and we looked at what did that do with us. And the connection was a lot of individuals and groups are coming together, maybe due to social unrest, war, or terrorism. We noticed life and death, cycles of life, new beginnings and endings in what many of the people wrote. Discovery and change, and out of chaos came renewal. There were lots of comments related to transition.